good podcast versus great podcast, because there's just so many podcasts out there today, right?
Yeah.
What makes a podcast great versus just a good one?
I'm going to try to boil it down to, I think, two or three things, right?
Hmm.
A great podcast is a great conversation, if
Hmm.
you ask me, between two people, right? I think that's the core aspect. A great podcast is a great conversation. And I know podcasts have different forms.
Hmm.
Here, I'm concentrating on the most popular form of podcasting, which is more an interview, Q&A, or discussion
Hmm.
format. But yeah, and I think a great conversation is a great podcast. Number two, where the guests are authentic and real with each other, that is what makes a great podcast, right? So if somebody is going to be very formal, artificial, give very, politically correct answers, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
That doesn't make for a very interesting podcast, right? It needs to be something where the guests are being authentic, they're being honest, they're being direct, they're being candid. That's something where people enjoy that, right? People don't enjoy artificial kind of
But how can you
conversations, right?
elicit that, Swapnil? Right? When you've got a guest and a host, how do you think that can be elicited?
Yeah, I think if you've seen people that are good hosts are
Hmm.
very good at asking the right kind of questions. They're very
Hmm.
good at making the guest comfortable. They're very good at conversations, basically, right?
Hmm.
So it takes somebody that's a decent host to do that, right? There's a certain amount of expertise that is required there. A good host can, even if the guest on the other side is introvertish, doesn't have a
Hmm.
lot of practice in having these
Yeah.
kind of conversations, he can make them feel very comfortable, ask the right kind of questions, be authentic, be genuine, and you'll find the guest on the other side really opening up and even them having a lovely and amazing conversation with you, right? So a lot of that goes to the host, right? So just going back to what's a good podcast series versus a great
Hmm.
podcast series, like I said, number one would be just an interesting conversation, right? Focus on that. Don't focus on anything else, right? Number two is it needs to be like real, authentic, candid, direct, right?
Hmm.
Those are the things that people enjoy versus it being scripted in some
Right.
way, artificial, scripted. People don't like that. They can see through that bullshit, right? They don't want that, right? The other kind of, I think, a podcast needs to be useful for people, right?
Hmm.
Which means that they need to get something out of it, right? Now, the usefulness of it could be you learn something from the podcast
Hmm.
in the form of some insights that you get, some existing information that gets reiterated in your head in some
Hmm.
form. The usefulness could be in terms of you being entertained in some way, right? So it could be that, but that podcast needs to be of some value or use to the person watching it, right?
Right.
In some format, right? So I think that's something that is an important characteristic of a great podcast series. And if you ask me from a brand's point of view or a company's point of view, right, having different kinds of guests really makes a big difference, right?
Hmm.
So you just don't have one type of a guest, right? You get a host of different kind of guests and therefore cover different type of topics, right?
Hmm.
That tends to make a good podcast in a good podcast series, right? So it's got little to do with whether it's virtual or in person, and
Hmm.
it's got more to do with all these things than that, right? Which is there. But yeah, this would be my few things, and there, of course, there are lots of other elements that we'll keep discussing as we go on, right? Of
Yeah.
what is the difference between an average podcast and a great podcast, right? But these are a few elements.